Midway through the June official visit period, Jeff Brohm and company still doing things on the recruiting trail. We'll talk about the national perception of the Louisville program as it pertains to recruiting with Jeff Brohm on today's episode of the show. Stay tuned.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Joining me today for the first time on the Locked On Louisville podcast, the recruiting analyst for the Locked On Podcast Network, Brian Smith. Brian, how are you, man?
Doing very well, sir. Doing very well. Anxious to dissect some Louisville recruiting because it's changed a lot. It has changed a lot.
It definitely has. And one thing that one of the reasons why I definitely wanted to bring Brian on, not just because of his expertise in recruiting, but his South Florida or Florida in general, the ties to the area. And I know that Louisville has been recruiting that area pretty hard. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about his recruiting as a whole. Deuce Adams recently awarded a 4-star. We'll also talk about the most recent Louisville commitment offensive lineman, Fred Johnson. Before we do that, I want to tell you that today's episode brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. But overall, Brian, big changes for the university over the past really 8 months or so. But this recruiting spike has been something that wasn't just coming along with Jeff Brohm. I mean, Scott Satterfield saw a lot of success early on in year 4 with that big Flyville 23 class that Jeff was able to keep intact. But, from NIL to whatever it may be, just talk about what Louisville was able to do on the trail. What's sort of the perception of the program, in your opinion, from a national perspective?
A lot of people were surprised because, Louisville was getting kids out of California, Texas, etc. And they traditionally, they recruited the South.
Sure.
A certain quarterback you and I talked about off the air, he's from Alabama. It's not like they hadn't recruited in the South, but all of a sudden they were getting kids that had major Pac-12, Big 12 offers that were even further away. And you're like, okay, they've decided to do this differently. So everybody was just kind of trying to feel it out. Now, where I live in Florida, it's nothing new. Louisville has recruited the state of Florida pretty much my whole life.
Sure.
And they've always gotten a ton of diamonds in the rough, kids that could really run, athlete types that can move around to different spots. But again, Texas, California, that was new. And I just remember going through some, I'm like, I've been following recruiting since about 1990. This has never happened at this level. So it's a data point that I'm still learning about. And my brethren, same thing. So I hope we can get a better understanding because, coaching change. Will Brohm really want to go recruit California consistently?
It doesn't seem like it early on. It doesn't seem like those guys in 23 are going to continue over. But one thing that I was intrigued about, and I had heard this multiple times throughout the fall from multiple people saying that even if Scott Satterfield, because there was a time where he could have possibly lost his job if not for a pretty solid end to the year. Had a great end to the season and ended up saving his job but leaving on his own. But the talk was that he was not the main reason why kids were committing to Louisville, which kind of shed light on the NIL infrastructure that they have in place. In your expertise and what you've seen, just how much from your perspective has NIL just completely changed the college recruiting landscape?
There is nothing remotely like it. I mean, it's not going to get into a whole lot of names, but kids are oftentimes making horrendous decisions. Parents wanting their kids to go to school the kid doesn't want to go to. The NCAA failed. Let's just start with the backbone of this. They didn't have any kind of guidance. They're scared to death to get sued, all the above, and it's made recruiting a complete mess. So NIL has changed everything because you could have a kid that wants to go to school X his whole life, committed, but then somebody comes in with upfront NIL money, which is, quite frankly, illegal, and that's where they go.
Right.
There's no way to predict anything anymore. I used to be able to, by September 1st, kind of pencil in a recruiting class for a team within a couple of guys. I'm lucky to get 5 kids committed at the end of the year on September 1st now because there's so much decommitting and flipping with NIL. It is something that needs to be reined in, if you will.
It's definitely interesting. Multiple coaches, coined it as opening Pandora's box. And I think that we are yet to sort of see the major impacts of it, sort of maybe a year or two down the line, in my opinion. But still, we're starting to see that, sort of trickle down into the transfer portal because players are unhappy at higher rates than we've ever seen. And guys are transferring. On the other side, NIL deals are not being fulfilled. Kids are being lied to, which we are seeing. But it is what it is. That means really that it's sort of like 1-year contracts almost, especially with the one-time transfer rule. I like what Brohm has been able to do in holding this Flyville 23 class together with some talented kids, and he's been able to go out in Flyville 24 and get some guys. But really where he's won recruiting has been the transfer portal. And I guess from what he's been able to do, there's been some ample playing time, not only getting guys in, but retaining a lot of that roster. That's pretty impressive, no?
Absolutely. I talked to several coaches, and they've echoed the same sentiment. If I have a chance to take two players that are equal, I'm going to take the kid that's been to college already, who's been away from mom and dad or whatever their home situation is, that's more mature. I know that doesn't make a lot of high school coaches and high school parents very happy, but that's not going to change. These guys get fired too quickly if they don't win immediately.
Mm-hmm.
There's no fixing that.
Sure.
Boosters are not very happy to give you checks when you lose. It's pretty simple.
I get
so
that.
The portal is a big part of this. And let's use Louisville as the example. If you get a 4-star D lineman that's played 2 years, UT Chattanooga or whatever, just a late bloomer that blossomed 40 extra pounds after he left high school, and he comes and starts for you, that might be the reason you beat Clemson. That might be the reason you beat North Carolina.
Sure.
It's everything.
Sure.
So if you win in the transfer portal, one can make a concerted argument that it's even better than winning on the recruiting trail because the kids are, again, more mature, physically, mentally, and everything else, more experienced. They have a better chance of hitting immediately. And that's what college coaches want. So show me the teams that are doing well that aren't using the portal. It's going to be this many, in some way, shape, or form. Even like Notre Dame and schools that are very conservative. Like Notre Dame took 5 or 6 transfers this year. It's different now. You have to use it.
There was a quote one time, and honestly, you can kind of apply it to everything. It's either conform with the times or get run over. And it sort of –
that is true.
Or it's not sort of – it definitely applies to this trend. But like I mentioned, one of the reasons why I thought having you on to discuss Florida recruiting for Louisville is because of your expertise in the state, from Indiana, but now living in Central Florida. Louisville has picked up a couple of 2024 guys from the state of Florida, most notably, obviously, TJ Capers. Isaac Brown is a big-time recruit from that area as well. Talk about Stanquan Clark from last year's class down from Miami. Look, Florida's always been really good to the University of Louisville. We've gotten some Lamar Jackson, Teddy Bridgewater. There have been some top names to come out of pretty decent, sort of, but no disrespect to either one of those guys or other guys, but the caliber of recruit that Louisville's used to getting was sort of like right here. And now it seems like over the past 2 classes it's kind of up to about right here, especially with TJ Capers. That caught me very off guard. Do you expect this trend to continue for Louisville? Is this a one-class wonder? Is this something that Louisville can build upon? Because, frankly, there's a lot of opposition in the Sunshine State, not only from the in-state schools, but you have SEC schools lurking all over the place.
Florida is the most unique landscape for recruiting in the country. There isn't a second, third, fourth, or fifth place. The kids down here are very fickle. I mean, all my buddies that I work with in the industry, doesn't matter which network, we run into each other all over. 100% consensus. It's the most difficult state to predict where kids are going to go because it's so individualistic. It's just the culture. So you can get a kid that his best friend wants to go to State U, go play for the Gators, and they recruit him just as hard, and he's not even interested. It is random. So every time Louisville walks into a high school, they should expect to be just as viable as the Gators, as the Noles, as the Canes. It's wild. You have to live here to understand. I can't possibly even explain it to you, let alone people that haven't lived here. But the state of Florida is
interesting. It's very interesting.
In the 80s and 90s, they put out these. I mean, it wasn't anywhere near recruiting rankings like they are today. Out of the top 25 kids in the state, give or take, 20 would stay in the Florida State, Florida, or Miami. Now, maybe 10 of those, maybe, will stay in state. Kids want to leave. Why not Louisville?
I believe it. Yeah, I mean,
they're Power 5, got a nice stadium. They've got, on TV every week. Everything's different than it used to be. Like, there used to be like 5 to 10 schools that got all the TV time. Oklahoma, Notre Dame, SC. Hell, East Carolina's on TV just about every week. I mean, seriously.
Shout out to the Buccaneers.
Yeah, there you go. But the point is, it's just this.
Right.
Kids are different. Mm-hmm. Florida kids in particular, Louisville should have success with. They come down to the state and play all the time, too, because of Miami and because of Florida State. They should absolutely get 2 or 3 kids minimum every year out of the Sunshine State.
I agree with that. And then Louisville obviously playing Miami pretty much every year going forward with the new ACC scheduling model. But nonetheless, I think it's very interesting you say that because obviously Louisville has been very big in the state of Florida, but Texas, not so much. Reuben Owens, it is what it is. But now Louisville has a 4-star rated quarterback, according to one service, Deuce Adams, who committed to the Cardinals about a month or so ago. We're going to talk about, his rise a little bit here in just a moment after we talk about our friends over at FanDuel, the title sponsor of the show. Baseball season is in full swing of things, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's $1,000 back in bonus bets if that first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. Don't miss your chance to snag that no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. Once again, FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel is the official partner of Major League Baseball. Heading on into the second segment of this recruiting episode of the show with the Locked On Podcast Network recruiting analyst Brian Smith talking about Jeff Brohm's recruiting. Obviously, Brian, Jeff Brohm with quarterbacks is a pretty solid match. He's done a pretty solid job, played quarterback, coached quarterbacks, and now is the head coach, Brian Brohm, on staff as well. Deuce Adams, 3-star quarterback from Texas, now a 4-star according to Rivals. I know that guys see some rising, before their senior season, competing in camps, doing things, doing this, doing that. When you look at Deuce Adams as a quarterback, does he we're splitting hairs here potentially, does he seem like a guy that's going to rise up more significantly as he gets into closer to signing day, or do you think he's probably where he's going to end up?
It could go higher. He has an advantage because he lives in the greater Austin, Texas area. That, like the state of Florida, has a lot of analysts. He's going to get seen more. And based on his film, he's actually been coached pretty good. A lot of high school quarterbacks, you can tell it's all arm talent, and they don't have much refinement. He's been coached. So I think he does have a chance to move up. And he's a good athlete, and he throws a pretty deep ball. So those are kinds of things that typically will help you. I wouldn't be shocked if he goes out and throws 30 touchdowns this fall and he moves up the ladder. Wouldn't be surprising at all.
Now, he's listed, granted, 6'1", 170 on 24/7 Sports. Sometimes not the most accurate, measurables out there. Do you worry at all? I know he has a very strong arm. Probably more so a pocket passer that can get out and use his legs rather than a true dual threat, in my opinion, at least in this stage of his career of what he showed at New Braunfels. But moving to a more solid area, does that lack of height, that lack of size sort of worry you at all in terms of his future ceiling?
It can, because, at the end of the day, you're more brittle at 170 than a desirable 215. A lot of guys had to get bigger. A certain guy out of Boynton Beach, Florida, that went up and won the Heisman at Louisville needed to add weight too. Some guy, But how much does he want it? Certain guys you can throw all the calories at. They got to do it, and they got to eat right when they're not at the facility. They got to eat right when they're out with their girlfriend or their friends. And those are the moments that are really awkward for teenagers and young 20-something-year-olds. It's not very friendly. Football is not very socially acceptable because you're never off clock. A 170-pound kid, the next year after he signs, is everything for him to do exactly what he's told and not what he wants to do. That's up to him, how mature. And it also goes back to why the portal, we talked about that early, is so popular. It's easier to get the kid that's 20 to do that than the 18-year-old. So I hope he listens to the trainers because Louisville's got a great training staff. They're going to do the right things. But if he can get up to 200 pounds and take more punishment, he is a good athlete. Like you said, he's a move quarterback. Like I like to call, he's not a dual threat, but he'll get outside the pocket and throw a dart. If you can extend the play, and that's what he does, he can absolutely hit a home run ball, hit a check down, whatever, but you're still going to take shots. He's got to gain some weight.
I definitely agree there. You look at his offer sheet, not necessarily all that notable. He does have that offer from Dave Aranda and the Baylor Bears, has been on campus for some unofficial visits, but it seemed like the vibes were, or at least the perception was that although they're not prioritizing him or going after him, that, maybe some of the other in-state schools are at least keeping tabs on him, but no official offers, it seems. Is there an opportunity? I understand, Texas is loaded at quarterback, but some of the other schools out there with a solid senior season in the greater Austin area, could you see some other Texas schools try to get in on the back half of this recruitment to try to undercut Louisville? Because, we're seeing it happen at record rates.
Here's the thing. There's no position right now that's more volatile than quarterback.
That's true.
You could have a team that right now, they're not even recruiting anybody else because they've got a commitment and they're set for next year. They're going to have 4 quarterbacks. They're good. Mm-hmm. Kid leaves in fall camp because he's pissed off about where he's ranked on the depth chart. Even with your commitment, you're down to 3. And your backup is a little iffy. Well, let's take a second quarterback. Well, that's going to be about 20% of college football. It could be A&M. Texas's depth chart's monstrous. But it could, outside of anybody besides Texas, ironic because he lives right there on the edge of Austin, pretty much everybody else has always got their finger on the button, if you know what I mean. Baylor could really actively go after him, TCU, SMU. It's possible, but you don't even know who it's going to be.
Yeah.
I tell everybody the same thing. You just have to keep recruiting quarterbacks because they're going to leave. Some are going to decommit. There's nothing you can do about it. Just recruit them as hard as you can, and where the chips fall, that's where the chips fall.
You hope you get in a little lucky. I am a big fan of his film. I thought that when I watched his film back when he unofficially visited back February or March, that I thought he was a little bit better than the ranking suggested. Granted, I'm not one of those people, Brian, that suggest that every commit that Louisville gets is underrated. I don't like to do that. I don't like to sunshine pump. I think it's unrealistic. But with that being said, I think that there is an avenue for Deuce Adams to be a solid starter at the ACC level, with that arm talent, with the intangibles, the ability to throw on the run, especially, moving to his left as well. What do you see as sort of the realistic expectations for a guy like Deuce Adams? Both realistic expectations, but also a possible ceiling as well.
2 things there. Number one, it goes back to him getting bigger. The arm talent, the athleticism, the mobility is there. But the other one is something that a little secret about the recruiting industry and being a part of some of these meetings with rankings. If there's a kid that's ranked at whatever spot, then he commits to a school that has a tradition-rich history at that spot, and they have that legendary coach still there, that ranking's more likely to go up. Well, Brohm can coach quarterbacks.
On 3 doesn't like that in terms of Louisville, but that's a conversation for a different day.
Well, there's a lot of biases. There's a lot of humans that don't like certain schools.
Sure.
It's just true. Brohm can coach QBs. So if you look at it realistically, and you got a kid that's teeter-totter, any class, they got a chance to go up. He's taking kids that were at Purdue. I'm like, Then they ended up being real good. So, he's got a track record.
For sure.
Now, this kid's got more talent than some of the kids he signed at Purdue, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. I would agree.
So why would you not expect him to be at least a starter by the end of year 3?
I agree.
You know what I mean? Like your redshirt freshman year, you're competing for the number 2 job. If things work out, maybe even compete for the start. Your 3rd year, you should be in that statement where I'm going to push for the starting job for the Louisville Cardinals. And if not, it's disappointing because the talent's there and the right coaches there.
I agree, and I agree for sure. I think it's a perfect segue to talking about this next guy. The most recent Louisville commitment also saw a rankings boost pretty much all across the board. Offensive lineman Fred Johnson. We'll talk about him here in a second. Before we do that, NBA draft, in my opinion, big Houston Rockets fan. I'm not sure if you're a big NBA fan, Brian, but huge Rockets fan on my side. Sorry about the Heat, by the way. I don't know if you're a Heat fan at all.
Well, I mean, I support them being down here, but, I mean, the Nuggets just went.
Well, there you go. Nonetheless, Locked On's NBA mock draft special is here. It's bigger than ever. Follow along the entire first round in a 6-episode ultimate mock draft experience. Only Locked On can deliver. Available anywhere you get your podcasts. But final segment of the show, discussing the most recent commitment, Fred Johnson. Louisville, over the past couple weeks, has had some pretty solid official visitor lists. It has had a good amount of programs, but a recent commitment following that official visit period, Fred Johnson from the state of Ohio, a place that Louisville has made it an effort. Hey, look, we are going to be taking local recruiting more seriously here. Going up head-to-head with Kentucky, Vince Morrow, Mark Stoops, known for recruiting the state of Ohio and getting a player like Fred Johnson. I mean, offensive lineman recruiting is tricky because of the rankings, but what do you kind of assess this, overall recruiting win for Louisville?
Anytime you get kids that you zeroed in on fairly early, that's a different kind of win than a lot of people would know. Talking to college coaches, they set their boards pretty early, and you see these signing day press conferences. Oh, we got all. Nobody gets everybody they want. It's a bunch of sunshine and rainbows. It's garbage. It's garbage. They missed out on kids, and they talked to us off the record about the ones they're mad about. This is a kid they wanted early enough. Kentucky doesn't like them or not. They do a really good job of evaluating.
They definitely do.
And, I mean, I think Stoops is one of the better coaches in the Southeastern Conference. He's just at Kentucky. It's harder to win there. But this is the kind of guy that Louisville, again, like they recruit in Florida, they get, and you're like, okay, red shirt, years, but they end up starting. Louisville has an incredible history with that. Cincinnati kids, Cleveland kids, Indianapolis kids, etc. Why not? And again, I like it when Stoops offers a kid, especially a lineman.
I was about to say, especially offensive lineman, because there's one thing I'll Mark Stoops for a couple reasons, but offensive line recruiting is like, okay, if they're in on a kid, especially from Ohio, which is their fertile recruiting ground, it's hard to overlook that. And especially it's a kid that, Brian, I was looking at his offers, 7 Power 5 offers since January 29th. Now, granted, there's this whole debate over whether an offer, when it is given, if it's committable or not. Very quickly, what's your take on that? I want to get that out of the way. What is Brian Smith's take on committable versus non-committable offers?
Number one, I hate it, but number two, I get it. Teams offer, and then they fill up at a spot, but it's still listed on his page.
Sure.
And you see fans bitch, oh, we didn't really want him. Well, you did at one point.
Right.
You filled up. So it is what it is. The commitment that doesn't happen because you have an offer, but you have to wait till this other kid makes a decision first. That ticks me off. Don't offer the kid if he can't commit that day. That happens a lot. So yeah, it's annoying.
I definitely agree. And one thing that I kind of talk to people about, and this is sort of the Louisville way, and you kind of hinted at this. I suggest sometimes that, especially kids going into their senior seasons, unheralded guys that play in very talented areas like Georgia, Florida, Texas, even Ohio, getting these guys on board when the rest of the nation doesn't necessarily know too much about them or they haven't blown up too much is probably pretty proactive in the grand scheme of things rather than having to go toe-to-toe with a guy who just recently became a 4-star. So I try to tell them, relax and trust the process because Louisville's not a blue blood program. The bread and butter has been getting 3-star level guys, building them up, sprinkling in an occasional 4-star, and focusing on player development.
You just defined Louisville's football history. It's true.
I'll agree to that.
It's true. Now, with that, you still need, especially defensively, if you're going to pick one side of the ball or the other to hit the home run on the rankings, it's defense.
I agree.
You can scheme more on offense, but there are only so many 6'3", 300-pound dudes that want to kill people. You know what I mean? Like they're playing D tackle. And I mean, there's just different kind of mentality, corners, stuff like that. And that's where Louisville's got to get better. And any program that's always seemingly 7-5, 8-4, that is like frustrating. If you look at D-line recruiting and corner recruiting, it's probably the biggest factor. So
right.
The O-line, I'm good with Louisville. They've developed well. They've taken a few kids portal-wise, whatever, to fix it.
Sure.
Now they need to find a way, come hell, come high water,
right,
to get those guys D-line. Like Capers could be an edge guy. That's a possibility. But in that realm, those are the guys you plug and play, and they just go chase the ball, see ball, kill ball.
Stanquan Clark. I have heard so much from spring ball to where, coming into spring, I'm like, I don't really like relying on true freshmen to come in and play inside linebacker right away. But it's almost like he's going to force the coaching staff's hand to play him because he's just essentially showing off that much.
I told a few guys at a jamboree last spring that were Power 5 coaches. I said, you better offer this kid. You better offer him. And some of the schools waited too long.
Thankfully, they didn't listen to you, Brian.
Well, I
appreciate them not listening.
Usually the problem there is the head coach. It's one thing to see it if you're the assistant, getting the head coaches to listen, who are very stubborn people, usually, is another. Sure. Louisville, they were one of the first schools to really go after it. Who did he sign with? Louisville. It matters, man. There it is. And he was murdering people. And we're talking about South Florida games. This is a different animal. I'm not trying to pick on other states. South Florida is a different animal.
What's understood doesn't need to be explained, and that South Florida is one of the premier spots for high school football in all of the country. But nonetheless, Brian, appreciate you having you on first time. Definitely going to be having you on more as recruiting gets going later into the summer and good things. But that's going to wrap up today's episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. We'll see you right back here tomorrow.